go. The 60s. It is the psychedelic era. It is the far out groovy peace era. And it is the era where major things changed in our culture. Knowing the past helps us understand the culture, and you have been learning about the past up until this point. This is the culture of the groovy or leave man, the hippie culture. Some people are just spaced out, flower power, all that good stuff. This is the time. If you've got your worksheet and want to work on it, this is counterculture decade. It is also a decade of great internal war, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit. We are in a war with Vietnam, and some of the biggest battling is within our own people, within our own nation, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on today. The population at the time, 1960, when this decade started, was 180 million people. So we're getting close to that 200 million mark. And I'm having technical issues. The average salary per year was $4,700. Now, depending on whether you were a white man, a white woman, a black man, or a black woman, that would change significantly. We'll get into that later as well, some of these things. This was known as Generation X. You need to remember the baby boomers from the 1950s. So the people came home from World War II, they settled down, got houses, and they had tons of kids. That created what was called they created this huge batch of kids who grew up, and then they had kids, and now we've got something that's called a generational gap. So the new kids of the 60s are very different than the kids of the 50s, the kids of the 40s. The generation that was the World War II generation had very traditional values in general. They cared about freedom, they cared about duty, they cared about honor, they cared about family, and they wanted to build good, solid families, and they wanted to have good traditional moral values, very similar to what we would say is a good way to live your life. The 60s came along, and the group that was rising up, not so much. Almost half the culture was under 18. That's like huge. That would be saying if almost half of America was under 18 years old, how would our culture be different? Because these teenagers are having so much power, I really don't know what's going on here. It work? Okay. And that's going to be a significant difference. We're going to see things called counterculture. Now, we're going to start with the look. Guys, you get a chance to look really weird for a change instead of normal. This is actually the Jackson 5. If you know who Michael Jackson is, this is him before he turned into the Michael Jackson you knew about. We'll just leave that there. Jackie Kennedy. Now, styles of the time, if you wanted to look really, really stylish, pretty much one woman defined style in that decade, and that was Jackie Kennedy. So, you remember the 50s style with the poofy skirts and stuff? Well, you're switching to the other side. New generation, new stuff. We're going totally straight now. And she had these little hats that they called pillbox hats because they look like a little pillbox sitting on her head. And that turned into a big trend. Wrong direction. You'll notice the difference. This is Queen Elizabeth. When she met with Jackie Kennedy, she's still wearing kind of the 50s look. And all of a sudden that looks old-fashioned because she's all dressed in this super sleek, very narrow, cool-looking 1960s outfit. So things changed significantly even in the way people looked. And boy, did their hair change. This is the decade for hair until you get to the 80s. The bouffants and the beehives, as they were called. So basically, the higher hair got, the better. My mom was a teenager. She talked about at their church, there was a woman whose hair was 1 foot high. They literally measured it. And she said she used to wrap her hair in toilet paper and lay it off the edge of the bed at night so it wouldn't get messed up until she got her hair done again. So this is kind of the decade when hairspray got to be a big deal and this goopy stuff, I don't remember what they called it, hair bond, hair glue, whatever it was, so that your hair could stay like this all week. And it's true. This isn't just, generic pictures. This is actually my family. Remember the guy who came back from the war and got married? That's him. That's my grandpa. This is my grandma with her beehive hairdo. This is my mom and her brothers who look very appropriately, 60s to almost 70s. The other fad, which is what some of us look like, is the more sleek look, and it was still poofy, but yeah, whatever. You can just look at it. Mini skirts became a huge trend. This actually wouldn't be considered a mini skirt, but I'm not showing you pictures of mini skirts. They got really, really, really short, and they came up with these things called go-go boots, which were boots that came way up to here that they could go dancing in. As I mentioned, the sleek hair was important, and so young girls would iron their hair so that it would be straight instead of poofy, and often they would curl it to make that big poof thingy in the front with soup cans. Try it sometime and try to go to sleep with that. The pain we suffer to be beautiful, right? A really big trend was this really pale lipstick and what they called cat eyes. So they would do eyeliner to come out like a cat. They had cat glasses that did the same. And yeah. The 60s was a huge time for music. Huge time for music. Honestly, a lot of the 60s music I think is fabulous. The Beatles were a big deal. The Beach Boys were a big deal. Aretha Franklin. And then there was this thing called Motown. Motown was a little bit like in the 20s, how jazz came to be a big thing, and it was the black community that created the jazz kind of music. Well, this is happening again. There's a lot of things in the 60s that mimic the 20s. But basically, it was this recording, like studio kind of thing, and they produced some of the best black music of the decade. Really, really, so a lot of the top hits that you would recognize, they came from Motown. Art got really psychedelic, whether you like that sort of thing or not. A Groovy Kind of Love, that was actually the title of a song. He got a groovy kind of love, maybe you've heard it. Flower power, right on, neato, far out, all kinds of great slang. Pretty much every generation, every group of teenagers is going to create new words. You guys have yours, texting. This was the beginning of flower power, of the flower child, of the groups that wanted to just go back to nature, man, and be far out, man, and they didn't want the government, and they didn't want structure, and they didn't want all these inhibiting things. They just wanted to go out and, like, be one with the universe stuff, you know, like, far out. Okay. And they would drive around in these fun little buses that were painted with flowers and peace signs. Now, this was important because they were very against the war. So the peace sign was this big deal all over the place during the 60s. Okay, we're running through this super quick because most of this decade, the most significant things happened in political arenas, and I want to have time to talk about it. So, inventions and new stuff. The space age began. Now, this is part of the Cold War still. And the Cold War is us and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, we're having the space race. Just like we had the race for, you know, the nuclear bomb, now we're having the race for who can get into space first. And it was important because of satellites. Somebody mentioned, you know, we have to get up there because we can't have space turn into an area to create weapons of mass destruction, but we want space to be a place where we can put things that will create knowledge and education or something like that. And if you think about it, the fact that when you get on a device today and it goes up to some satellite and what comes back is basically all the known information of the free world so you can think for yourself instead of strictly communist propaganda. Thank you, space race. Thank you, 1960s. But what that did was create this huge craze of fads, like everything was about space. It was hilarious. If you've ever seen the movie Toy Story, it's all about this new space toy that comes in and nobody cares about all the old toys anymore. And that was like for real, man, you know? Space shoes, so you could look like you were whatever. You know, space toys, space everything. Space fashion. Their ideas of what space would really look like were not so realistic, but that's okay. Who cares? Space shows, the Jetsons, you know, that was that little animated show about space life in 2020, you know, in our time. Star Trek, that was the beginning of Star Trek, and if you notice, they, you know, their hair and their clothes looks kind of 60s, and they would go to these alien countries, supposedly, alien planets, and they would meet these aliens, and they look kind of like Godzilla, or maybe they look like humans, who were wearing, shiny silver 60s outfits and shiny silver 60s makeup. It was amazing when you start a trend how far it goes, just like planets all over the place. Even space houses, little UFO houses like this. And there was actually one of these in Pensacola near where I went to college. I saw it a whole bunch. It was really cute. Like, I wanted to go inside and see what it was like. Everything was all about the space race. Moving on. Other new things. This was the beginning of 911. We can thank Lyndon Johnson for that. The beginning of Walmart, before it took over the world. The first Super Bowl. Green Bay and somebody else. Green Bay won. Thank you. The cars changed, station wagons. And in station wagons, they would have these big benches across the back, and you could sit and hang out with all your friends, and there weren't any seatbelt laws or anything like that. Sharpies, the zip code, and lava lamps, which were totally psychedelic and groovy and far out all at the same time. The dollhouse that was made out of cardboard. See the old TV and the really, wow, 60s looking furniture. Little easy bake oven. Hot Wheels were invented, and the G.I. Joe action figure. If you don't know, G.I. means government issue, as in the government sent you to war to be a soldier. And they started calling the soldiers G.I. Joes, which is where the toy came from, the show came from. G.I. Joe, real American hero. I don't know why I know that. My uncle, whose name is Joe, was actually overseas one time, and the people got to know the G.I. Joes, right? And so he got off the boat, and people were like, hi, Joe, hi, Joe, hi, Joe. And he's like, why do all these people know my name? The light bright was invented. So there was some cool, interesting, good stuff. Now we got to move on. Politics. This decade was phenomenal. The very first televised presidential debate. It was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had already been a vice president before, and he was running for the presidency. This showed the power of television because the people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon won. The people who watched it on TV thought that JFK won. And that just shows you how significant your appearance is. And so from then on, politicians understood they needed to harness this power of television if they wanted to get the American people. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Now, remember, in the 50s, the kids were having hide under your desk in case of a nuclear bomb, little drills, right? This is when it just about happened. This is the closest that America ever got to nuclear war before or since. And now I'm going to show you basically kind of what happened so that you really understand it. So, Hopi, I need you to get the lights. And Moses and Joshua, come here. Woo! Right. All right. I need, let me see, Rebecca and Hallie, come here. All right, so remember we're in the Cold War. So it's the U.S. against, y'all just hang out there. The U.S. and the Soviet Union. Rebecca, hold on to that. Hallie, hold on to this. I want you to hold it up. Now, the Soviet Union, boys and girls, oops, let me make sure everybody can see it. All right, the world. We are the world. We are the children. The Soviet Union is Russia and a bunch of these Stan countries. They were all one thing. Big, huge collection of groups of people. And America, as you know, is way over here. So if the Soviet Union wants to nuke America, that's a really long shot, literally. So the Soviet Union makes an alliance with Fidel Castro of Cuba. Okay, let's just make this clear. America, Cuba. Thank you. Can I have a seat? Cuba was 90 miles off the coast of America. Well, it still is. So that's about the distance from here to Augusta. If they want to shoot a nuclear bomb at us, we are in big, big trouble. So, to explain this, I have some nuclear missiles with me. They look like squirt guns, but don't be fooled. I'm the Soviet Union. Dun, dun, dun. You didn't know the Soviet Union wore cat eyes and had 60s hair, but I'm the Soviet Union. Dana Spivey is America. I hate Dana Spivey. All right. Now, if I want to shoot him, it's Dana Spivey. Okay. If I want to shoot America, that's too far, right? So, what do I need to do? Well, I make friends with Tate back there. Tate's Cuba. Tate's Fidel Castro. So I'm like, okay, if I want to get America, okay, I've got nuclear missiles, remember? So I'm going to tell my ships. Now, Dana's getting nervous because he's starting to hear these reports about the Soviet Union sneaking nuclear weapons to Fidel Castro. Go ahead and give it to him and then come back. You're my ships, you know? So he takes his spy plane, Jordan, and he tells his spy plane, go and look around and see what you can see. So the spy plane gets up, and flies around and goes and sees what they can see over Cuba. And comes back and reports, what do you see? He's like, oh man, they've got weapons. They've got nuclear missiles. Now, we're not talking like one or two. Look at this. All these are missile sites. As in, if they push the button, yeah. So this is bad, right? Well, then, Fidel Castro shoots down the spy plane and kills him. Now you're dead. We're very sorry. Now this is getting really, really tense. Because honestly, if these were real guns, you would all be very nervous right now.
I would run out of the building.
That would be a good idea, but you're a country, so you can't. Okay, so America, JFK is the president at this point. He got the presidency. He's a brand new president. It's like, hey, guess what? We're going to get nuked. What are you going to do? So this is very stressful. This is 13 days of our history. 13 days. Probably the most tense days in American history. So he decides, okay, we have to do something. But obviously, I mean, we have a nuclear bomb. We have nuclear capability, but you don't want to shoot off a nuclear bomb because that's going to start nuclear World War III. And if everybody has nuclear bombs, we start shooting them off, it's the end of the planet. We don't want to do this. Yeah. So he starts this thing that he calls the quarantine. And what it means is the ships now, which have more missiles, now we're headed slowly down the middle. He sends out Anna Rose as a blockade, and Lily as well. So you're going to help blocking and you're going to block them.
You started World War III.
There we go. You're the blockade. And you shot these guys. Don't let them get past me. So they're doing a blockade and they're stopping all ships from the Soviet Union to Cuba to check for weapons. Now, obviously, these guys have weapons. So now you're nervous. Hide your weapons. You don't want them to see your weapons. So now, here we are, facing off in the ocean. As one person put it, eyeball to eyeball with the potential of nuclear war. What's going to happen? America's kind of holding its breath. Now, this may seem like this funny little story and stuff, but for the people actually living it, it was really scary. In the end, the Soviet Union ships quietly, well, you know what? They stayed there for a little bit. And Castro, who is hiding in a bomb shelter so that he doesn't get hurt, tells the Soviet Union they need to push the button and start a preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. As in, he was ready to go, and he was just waiting for permission to push the button. So we're all waiting, and we're all tense. Who's going to shoot first? What's going to happen? Is Florida going to be blown off the map? And so finally, the Soviet Union says, okay, guys, come on back. And you guys can sit down. And you put your guns away. And we all are And the crisis is over, at least for now. Now, my mom was 11 years old when that happened. Thanks, Mom. How many of you were 11? Anybody? Okay. They had a plan at her school because she lived in Florida, as in the first spot that would get hit if the missiles were launched. And so what they did, I can't even imagine. They had to bring 3 changes of clothes and a jug of water to school, and they had to have that with them all the time because there were 14,000 troops, by the way, who had come down to Florida ready for the war. This was happening. Florida looked like a war. And if it ever happened, they sent the first bomb. They had this evacuation plan that they were going to take all the kids from the school, put them on buses, drive them up farther north to a school farther north, at which point they supposedly are going to meet their parents. For real? Well, she had little brothers, and one of them was in kindergarten, and she was just worried she wouldn't be able to find her brothers if all this stuff happened. So you can try to imagine what it would really be like if somebody was threatening to blow us up and what was going to happen and how we're going to make a plan for that. So that was actually part of our history in 1962. And so it gets solved, thank the Lord, and we're still here, and so is Florida, and that's good. So that's done. Well, time goes by a little bit. JFK is the president for a little bit, but he decides to go to Texas on this trip, and it's a really nice day, and so he tells him not to put the cover over the top of his car, and he gets shot in the head twice, and he's assassinated, and he's dead. Boom, done. And the culture in our country who had gotten through this terrible thing, who had started out with hope, they were excited about this new decade, it basically just got killed. Because Kennedy, interestingly enough, I don't have any respect for his character. He was an extremely immoral guy, and he was a liar. He lied about his health. He lied about, But as far as what he was doing for the country, again, the image that you present, America kind of was in love with their family. Here was this young, good-looking, cheerful, positive guy who loved America, and he had this gorgeous young wife. He had these cute little kids, and so it was kind of like this perfect American family, or so it looked. And so we're going to have a perfect America, and it's going to be great. Yeah. They called it Camelot. And if you know anything about King Arthur and the story of Camelot, you know it's not going to turn out so well. And it didn't turn out so well. He gets shot. He's dead. This is Lyndon B. Johnson on the plane getting sworn in as the new president. Jackie Kennedy is right next to him in the suit that's still covered in her husband's blood. This is history happening. This is at the funeral when the body went by. This is little John. I think it was his 3rd birthday that day, and he was saluting his father. Right next to her is Bobby Kennedy, who was his brother, who was going to run in the future. This man is Lee Harvey Oswald, who was arrested for the murder. Now, whether he committed it or not, people have been talking about that for the next 60 years. Thing is, when they were taking him from one place to another, somebody came by and shot him. This was actually caught on TV, which for America, we weren't used to live TV things actually happening, so this was very shocking. And with him being silenced, all the conspiracy theories came out, and nobody knows to this day really who was behind it. Was it just him? There were some freaky, weird people. I'm going to have to... Okay, so here's this culture. Everything's just gone chaotic, la 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 la. And we've got these teenagers now and these young people who are doing this counterculture thing. So they're kind of like, we don't want to be like the traditions of our parents. We don't want to we want freedom too. Now, the parents wanted freedom from, like, communism and oppression and death. These kids wanted freedom from everything. They wanted freedom from morals. They wanted freedom from rules. They wanted freedom from all of it. I want to do what I want to do. I want to do my own thing, my life, my clothes, my stuff, that whole thing. So they started marching. And they started marching on behalf of a cause. And they marched for a lot of causes that decade. There were women marching. They were marching for women's lib and women's rights. There was a book came out called Feminine Manifesto. And it basically said something akin to women who were at home raising their kids and that sort of thing were a mass of simpering ruffles filled with unexpressed rage. Yes. Really? Who knew? So they were like, if you are a traditional woman, you are oppressed. They're oppressors. You need to be free. You need to go do your own thing. You need to go have your freedom to do whatever it is that you want to do. And so a lot of people jumped in on this. They were like, that sounds like fun. Let's go march. And they kind of thought, if we get freedom, so we're going to be just the same as guys, then we're going to be happy. Now, 60 years later, they're still marching, and are they happy? You can think about that. All right. That wasn't the only thing. I'm going in the wrong direction. That wasn't the only thing they marched about. I did enjoy this picture, though. Enough is enough, you ignorant men. Yowzers. Okay. So if you're like, oh, it's so bad now, and it's never been like that before, hello, the 60s. There's nothing new under the sun. They marched for women's rights. They marched for black rights. They marched for Latino rights. They marched for Native American rights. I mean, they were marching for rights. They were marching against the war. There were tons of protests about the Vietnam War, and we're going to spend a lot of time on the Vietnam War next week. But that was your peace symbols and your flower power and all that was get out of the war. We shouldn't be in it. We should just be happy and be loved. So the older generation that was, we have to stop communism so that the free world can stay free, these guys were kind of a little cynical. They grew up hiding under a desk because we didn't seem very free. And so it's almost as if they were like, this isn't working, so let's stop fighting communists and let's just be happy and go out in the field and pick flowers. This is actually a Democratic National Convention later in the decade when they got together and the war protesters and, you know, it didn't work out too well, started a riot. And at the end, Nixon became president, and we'll talk about him next week too. Okay, that's general politics. At this point, we want to spend some real time on the civil rights movement. It is significant. A lot of the aspects of the civil rights movement started in the 1950s, such as Rosa Parks refusing to sit on the back of the bus, and actually the law against segregation in schools, but there was such a huge backlash from the white community that pretty much nobody did it. So a lot of these things actually started in the 50s, but they blew up in the 60s. People were marching about things, and a lot of times it's easy to look at history and you look at these pictures and you're like, you can make your own decisions. But if you really want to understand what it was like, talk to somebody who was there. Now, obviously, if you talk to someone who was there, they give you a singular individual perspective. But sometimes that's a good thing because it's human. Kind of like my mom talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, suddenly it makes it real. It's not just this story and these interesting facts. It's a little kid who's going to get shipped off if she survives. And with this, again, I was talking to my mom last night about it, and she started remembering things that she hasn't thought of in a really, really long time. Her school integrated in the 60s. So I'm going to tell you some of her experiences and her story while you see some of these pictures, because sometimes it's easy to think, well, it wasn't that bad, it wasn't that big of a deal. I want you to see some pictures to see what things were really like. So my mom went to a little tiny white school in a little tiny white town, and it was a good town. They were nice people. Things were segregated, but it wasn't a racist town, per se. Now, there were racist people. For example, here is actually a white march and a black march going on at the same time. The white one is talking about racial intermarriage begins with holding hands in the first grade, as in that's why we shouldn't integrate, because then they're going to start getting married, which is true, but apparently they thought that was a terrible thing. There were even a lot of Christians who talked about we're supposed to stay with our own kind. You can study the scriptures and find out how unbiblical that actually is, because you know we all come from the same race and we were all made in God's image, and all the different colors are just pigment variations. But here's this little kid marching, and her sign says, "The Lord made us different for a reason." Wow. And these guys are marching saying, don't be afraid, to mix the schools. So they made a law toward the end of the decade. It was kind of like this forced segregation because people weren't segregating, even though there was a law that they could. So then they started making it happen. And what that meant was send a few kids, and send the military with them. We'll get to the 9 in a minute. But in her particular community, what this meant was the entire black school was forced to come over and integrate with the white school. Now, she said this was kind of silly because the black school had a newer school and it actually had air conditioning in it, and it was a bigger school, but it was in that part of town. And of course, nobody was going to tell the white people to go over to the black people part of town, so they had to come over here. And she said it was ridiculous because they didn't have enough room. So here are these kids, they're having class in the gym, they're having class in the cafeteria, and she said she was in an advanced program, an advanced class, and in her class, there were 2 black girls that got put into it. And she said they were so shy and scared. And you can kind of understand why. There was so much hate, and it wasn't simmering. It was verbalized and yelled, and KKK people, and there was just a lot of bad going on during not just that decade, but the previous decades before it. So they even missed one of the graduation events because of a bomb threat. There were white groups that would go around causing trouble because of this whole segregation thing, and it was a real mess. And she said that, she just felt so sorry for these poor kids because they didn't want to leave their school and they didn't want to leave their friends. And it was a good thing because it led to good things, but it was almost like that time there were a lot of casualties in the meantime on the way to the good thing. So that's one perspective. You can find about, let's see, what was it, 180 million other perspectives? This is Lyndon B. Johnson, and this is Martin Luther King Jr. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most famous people in our history. He preached peace, and he literally preached. He was a Baptist preacher. He preached, we do need to make a change, but we need to do it peacefully. We should not be doing this violently. He was very anti-violence, and it's very easy for violence to start with things like this. And there was a group, the Black Panther group, that was more into violence. And then the Black Power group came up after that, and they were more violent. But MLK kept saying, no, 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 that's not the way to make this work. Do it the right way. Okay, just to give you kind of an idea, this is, they called them the Little Rock 9. This is Little Rock, Arkansas, and this is the first time there was going to be this major, they're going to let some black kids go into the white school. So what happened was they picked 9 kids who were, they thought they were psychologically strong enough to handle what it was going to be like when they went over to the other school, because it was going to be bad, and they knew it. So this was 1954, so this is before they're forcing the whole schools to integrate. So they declared it unconstitutional. So this is 1957 when they decide to mix this up. So the governor, he calls in the National Guard to block the black kids from getting into the white school. This is the governor. So then the president sends in 1,200 federal troops, because at this point, there's 1,000 angry white people that have created a mob because they don't want these kids coming into their school. This is actually happening in our country. So you got, there's a lot going on. It did end up happening. This is the day. The Little Rock 9 was 9 kids, and they were all going to come together, which would be helpful. But this girl didn't get the information, and she came by herself. And if you noticed from the picture, the faces behind her, and just, you can imagine the things that were being shouted at her and the things that were being said or thrown or whatever. But it took military in a line for her to be able to get in and be in this school. I can't imagine what that must have been like. The kids were mistreated throughout that year, kicked, beaten, acid thrown in the face, an effigy burned in the lot outside of school. One of them was pushed down a flight of stairs. They were barred from extracurricular activities. So this is what integration looked like at the beginning. And as much as I love integration, it was a hard start. It was a really difficult time in our nation. So this is the good side of it. The big speech, the I Have a Dream speech, which I'll send your parents a link to so you can hear the actual speech. I dream of a day when my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I believe about 200,000 people showed up for that speech. One of his most famous sayings is that hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And it was true, because when things did get violent and there were all these clashes, all it does is create more violence and more clashes. It wasn't a good solution. Unfortunately, he ended up getting assassinated as well. Okay, this one is actually a really cool way to deal with prejudice. So we've got long-standing prejudice, and they were trying to deal with it. Some people were dealing with it in violent ways. Some were trying non-violent ways. This was called a sit-in. And what happened was, at Woolworth's, which was this store that also had a counter, like a little soda shop counter where you get a sandwich or a drink or something, the black people were allowed to come into the store and shop, but they were not allowed to be given any food or drink. There was this idea that they were dirty, and so you don't want to be cross-contaminating. That's why the different water fountains and stuff was so, ugh. So these guys came in and sat down, and they were not given anything. They were not allowed to order anything, and so they stayed. They didn't do anything. They didn't yell, scream, march, nothing. No poster, no nothing. They just sat there. And people found out about it, and I think they came back the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and after a while, more people came with them, and was like, this is a good idea. And there were more people coming in, and then after a while, in other stores, people were coming in and sitting, and it wasn't just black people. There were good people on both sides. There were bad people on both sides. Excuse me. So after a while, the sit-ins got to be a thing, a sit-in, and it lasted for 6 months. They kept doing this, and it wasn't always pretty. If you see this picture, people are dumping stuff on them. I'm sure they got a lot of unpleasant experiences, but after 6 months, they were like, okay, fine, we'll serve you. So they won, without being violent, without screaming and yelling, just by being patient and persistent and taking it. Now, as I mentioned, it wasn't all peaceful. After MLK was assassinated, there were 125 riots in the country. It just exploded. The stuff was getting burnt all over the place. It was terrible. And the Black Power group got much, much bigger. Malcolm X also got assassinated. This is actually on the Capitol steps, if you can believe that. Can you imagine doing this now? And surprisingly, they are there to protest gun control legislation. So the riots were all over the country after the assassination, and it was just this huge time of chaos in our country, and confusion and hatred and revenge and anger. It was really bad. And it wasn't in every spot, and it wasn't every group of people. If you think about it, like right now, if somebody was to talk about America in this decade, we'd say, well, this decade, America went woke. People were woke. Now, are any of you woke? None of us are woke. We're not into the woke thing. We don't live that way. We don't have those values. But they would say American culture was this way. So it's not that everybody in the whole country was jumping in on this. It's just that this was the big thing that was happening, and it was happening a lot. Okay. That was a lot. Let's go. The bad stuff. We're doing that first because it's really overwhelming. This decade was sad. The bad stuff was assassinations. JFK gets assassinated. MLK gets assassinated. Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated. Malcolm X, there were a whole bunch of assassination attempts, people were getting killed. These were the big ones. And so again, the leaders of the time were getting targeted. It's really sad. This was the decade when morning prayer, morning recitation of the Lord's Prayer, and morning Bible reading in public schools was declared unconstitutional and removed. And you can think about how that fits with what is happening in this culture of freedom from morals and from rules, and then kind of the results and consequences. Okay, let's just be done with all of that. Let's talk about some good things. Were there any good things that happened in this decade? Well, yeah, the lava lamp, you know? Okay, this is one I had to tell you about. Some people did it right. They knew this was wrong, but within their sphere of influence, they did what they could. Now, I don't know if you can see this guy. He's Mr. Rogers. Anybody know who Mr. Rogers is? He had this show that was real slow and calm, and he took off his shoes and asked you to be his neighbor, and he did puppets, and if you watch it now, it's considered very slow, but it was really good for kids. During this turbulent time, when stuff is so chaotic, he was this calm and understanding person and helped him kind of deal with all this stuff. Well, he hired this African-American man, and he hired him to be on his show, and he said he wanted him to be a cop. And this man did not want to play a cop, because his experience with police was not a pleasant one. But he took the job anyway, and he was presented as, for one, an African-American policeman, and for another, a good one, and a good man. Well, then one day, on his show, Mr. Rogers had a little kiddie pool. Now, to us, this might not mean anything. I need to give you some history. Pools were segregated for a long time. There were white pools, there were black pools, and you never mixed. So if you wanted to go to the black pool, you weren't allowed. If they wanted to come to the white pool, they were not allowed. And this wasn't so long ago. Daniel Spivey's mom, Daniel and Luke's mom, she remembers when there were still segregated pools in Madison, Georgia. It was a very real thing. So in her lifetime is when that finally changed. So Mr. Rogers says it's a really hot day, et cetera, and he goes through this whole thing. He has this little kiddie pool. He fills it up with water so they can cool their feet, and he sticks their feet in the same kiddie pool. And there's a shot on this show. They focus just right in on these 4 feet. And for us watching, we just be like, yeah, so what? This was huge. He didn't say a word about who's what race. He didn't say a word about color. He didn't say a word about prejudice, not one single word. He just sat there and let it watch their feet and say, isn't this nice? And then they got all done, moved on with the show, but he helped change the culture. It's because little kids watched that, and they were like, oh, it's okay. It's not a bad thing. Another one, Charles Schulz, who was a believer. He used his comic strip. Again, we would look at this now and be like, this was huge. This was very controversial, very controversial. He created a little black character for his little white comic strip with little white kids, and he showed up, and he says, I'm Franklin, and the kid reaches out and shakes his hand. It makes me so sad that this was such a big deal, and so many people complained about this. But anyway, this was a major moment in our culture. And Franklin becomes part of the story. His dad was fighting in Vietnam. Here's this one comic strip. Is this your beach ball? Hey, yeah, thank you very much. I guess this is when he reached Charlie Brown. I was swimming out there and it came floating by. Now, they're swimming in the same beach. Again, that was another big deal. My silly sister threw it into the water. I see you're making a sandcastle. It looks kind of crooked. I guess maybe it is. Sorry, where I come from, I'm not famous for doing things right. Now, of course, Charlie Brown was talking about he's not famous for doing things right because everybody's always like, Charlie Brown was such a blockhead. But if you think about it on a bigger scale, it means something. Okay, so weird. Now, y'all, this was a weird decade. There were so many things I could have put on here because it was a weird decade, you know, being all psychedelic and everything. But I just picked 3. This one, single women. They couldn't have credit cards because people thought they couldn't be trusted with them. So if you wanted a credit card as a woman, your husband had to come and co-sign for it in case you went off and just went buying a bunch of bouffant stuff or something. Okay, thanks. So you can kind of see why some of them were marching. I want my own credit card. This is my daughter, by the way. There was this theory that how you burped as a baby would determine what kind of an adult you would be in the future. So I'm just going to read this. 1964, at the International Congress of Psychiatrists in London, psychiatrists being so brilliant, Dr. Milton Berger presented a paper in which he suggested that a baby's burps might be predictive of its personality and future success in life. A baby with strong and clear burps, he said, was likely to grow up to become a leader. However, a baby with soft, dithering burps would be a nobody. So I guess if your baby had dithering burps, I don't even know what that sounds like, you better straighten them up. Strong and, yeah. Not sure how he tested this theory, but, yeah. And this one's my favorite. This man got so tired of planes flying over his head. Okay, he was in Munich, and there were German planes and American planes, and they would fly over his house, apparently, and he didn't like the noise. So he finally gets sick of it, and he goes out, and he builds this thing and starts launching Bavarian potato dumplings at the planes. In 1 week, he launched 120 dumplings. He could feed a lot of planes. Can you imagine living nearby and all of a sudden all these dumplings start landing in your yard? Like, what's going on? He never did actually hit a plane, but he was so annoying that the Luftwaffe and the American planes finally gave up and decided to fly somewhere else. So if you want to win the war, go for some dumplings. Okay. So we actually made it through that week, made it through this era. In the 1970s, well, then we got to talk about Vietnam. So it's going to get worse before it gets better, boys and girls. But here's the thing I wanted to say. In every decade, you have good stuff and you have bad stuff. And you see things in your culture that are right and that are wrong. What do you want to be known for? Do you want to be known as the victim? Do you want to be known as the oppressor? Do you want to be known as the person who is hateful and bitter, and every time you got the chance you talked about how wrong everything was? Do you want to be Mr. Rogers or Charles Schultz and make a difference in the way that you can? And my grandpa, that guy I showed you way back, he was a little Mexican boy growing up in the West. And he knew what it was like to be prejudiced against. But you know the thing is, I didn't know that, details about that, until last night when my mom brought it up. He didn't raise his kids to feel like victims or to feel like he was prejudiced against and he was, oh, it was so sad and we need to go marching now because it's so wrong, etc. He grew up, he went to the war, he got married, he had children, he raised them in God's way. He became a preacher. He was very well respected in his community. He actually got blackballed by the Southern Baptists because he invited a black man to come in and speak in his church. And the white community wasn't ready for that yet, and they didn't like it. And so he dealt with issues for doing the right thing, I guess you could say. But through it all, there was a chance to be a light and to be goodness and to do the right thing when everybody around you, it seems like, is doing the wrong thing or even just reacting the wrong way. So right now in our culture, we got some major stuff going on. Major. And you can be thinking through it according to the scriptures, what's good, what's wrong. Prejudice in any form is wrong against anybody. How are we going to respond? Who are you going to be? What are you going to do? Do you want to go and march? Do you want to be part of a sit-in? Do you want to go start a fire somewhere? What kind of a difference do you want to make in the future? You guys are the culture of the next decade. I don't know if you've thought about that. We've been talking about the culture of every single decade, and a lot of the power comes through the young people. They're the ones who make a lot of the change. Y'all are it for the next decade. I don't know what kind of fads you're going to come up with. They'll probably be pretty silly. but that's okay. The question is, what values are you going to have? Now, this was a counterculture that went in a very immoral direction. They wanted to be free from all that stuff. Right now, we are in a counterculture, and ironically, it's the opposite. The counterculture of today is the culture that says we do want to have morals, we believe there's such a thing as truth and not truth, and we want to live by the power of the scriptures. And that looks different than what our culture is saying, what is good and what is wrong, what is truth and what is untruth. You can make your own truth, that sort of thing. You're going to be the ones who are different. Are you strong enough to handle that? Are you okay with that? What are you going to do when somebody calls you an idiot for what you believe? You can think about that. Talk to your parents about it. Talk to your parents about counterculture. And you can talk about this counterculture, talk about your counterculture, and how they've decided why they're part of it. Why are they willing to go against what our culture says is good and bad, right and wrong? That's a big deal. Are they getting any flack for it at this point? I don't know. Why don't you ask them? Yes?
Did you know Martin Luther King Jr. was stabbed with a letter opener? So someone tried to kill him, and he didn't tell them to go find the person. Yeah. Wow.
That's creepy. Okay, for our last 5 minutes. Whew. We got it all done, y'all. We want to talk about the projects. You've got your worksheet in front of you. I'm going to read through some of the topics. Now, some of them are things we haven't even covered yet, but we'll get there. I'm going to read through it, and I want you to kind of think in your head, ooh, I would like to do that one. When class is over, you may come up here, and if you have picked a topic at this point, write it down on your thing. But if you picked a topic, cross it out and write your name next to it so I know who's doing what. Got it? All right, so here's one. It's through the 20th century. So you're going to talk about from the beginning all the way through how things changed with inventions, education. How did education change? We just saw a little bit of it right now. Transportation. We went from the horse and carriage to like the spaceship. I mean, think about that. In 1 century, that's amazing. Fashion. Oh yeah, I want pictures. Music. Okay, changing throughout the century. This is deeper things like the role of women, the traditional family. How has that changed up until the end of the century? U.S. patriotism. How did that change through all of this? The Bible influence. Again, we saw stuff in this decade that made a difference. Homeschooling. How is that seen throughout this century? Very, very interesting. Race relationships, if you want to go there, be able to explain things. The history of computers, that would be fun. Operation Desert Storm, we're going to get to that. American POWs in the different wars. Cuban Missile Crisis is already crossed out. 1904 World's Fair, already crossed out. The Korean War, the Berlin Wall, the Scopes Monkey Trial. There is also a batch for high schoolers only. I'll get to that in a second. A famous American figure in the 20th century, Baxham. Any U.S. president, go for it. I mean, write down which one you're going to do, because we don't want to have repeats. Thomas Edison, Helen Keller, Albert Einstein, the Wright brothers, Amelia Earhart, MLK, Eleanor Roosevelt, Charles Drew, Albert Sabin, don't know how to make his name, but he was a good guy. If you want to pick any of these, make a poster on them. And basically how cool your poster is, how many pictures, how much information, whether it's clear and a person can understand it, that's going to determine your level of points. For high schoolers, we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to talk about some of the counterculture that we're in right now, in the sense of addressing some things. For example, a biblical response to the feminist movement. What does the Bible really say? Defining and comparing capitalism, socialism, communism, and fascism. What are the 4 things? What do they mean? How does that apply in real life? Evolution is not truly science. It's just a theory. And if the theory gets taught in public schools, then the theory of creation should also be taught in public schools. Prove that. Make a poster. Slavery is not only a black and white issue. I don't know if you know this, but we have a history of slavery in this country, and it wasn't all black people. We had white slaves as well. There were Irish slaves that, it goes way back. And global imperialism. One of the thoughts is that America is the great imperialist. Well, if you know anything about like England, they had that issue too, but way back, the Muslims had that issue that basically people have been taking over other countries since Bible times. So kind of presenting that because people are being taught certain things and it may not be the whole truth. So you have the opportunity to tell the whole truth but you need to know the whole truth. So do your research. Make it awesome. All right. Any questions before we're done? Wow, I'm shocked. Peace, y'all. Peace out.